Hi everybody, this is Kate Haley with Glazer's Camera. I hope you're having a great Thursday. I can't believe it's already Thursday and already the middle of November. Can someone tell me where 2020 went? Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are excited to be here this afternoon going into the evening to talk about macro photography with our friends from Sigma. But before we get started, I want to share just a couple of things, just to let you know some things that are going on with the store right now. So as you know, we are open 7 days a week. We have been for several months now. Our rentals department is also open 7 days a week. Check out the hours on our store for sure. You can make your purchases online in the store, place those orders for curbside pickup. All the options are available to you. We are getting some questions about the holidays and the holiday sale that we normally do every year. As many of you know, we do a normally a two-day big sale where we have vendors like Aaron from Sigma come in, hang out, and help you guys make your selections for yourself and family and friends for the holidays. But with everything going on with the pandemic, we did make the decision to not do that two-day weekend sale, but fear not, we have deals for you. Not just over 2 days, but off and on, you're gonna receive emails with promotions from vendors and special in-store promotions that we're putting together on our own. So check your emails for those promotions. Come in, say hi. We do have staff here to answer your questions, of course. So lots of options. We just want you to know when it comes to the holidays, we've got a lot of great offers happening. The first newsletter went out today, as a matter of fact. So check your inbox if you haven't yet to see what's happening this week. There will be weekly promotions on specific lines of product like paper. That might be the promo that's happening this week, so check it out. If you're not on mailing list, go to our website, look for newsletter, and sign up so you can be sure to get updates on all the promotions happening, as well as other events like what we're doing tonight. But with all that said, I don't want to keep you guys waiting. We've had a lot of interest in this topic, so it's really great to know that so many of you are interested in macro photography. We're very excited to present this session tonight. With us, we have two folks from Sigma. We have Aaron Norberg, who's our regional sales rep, who, if you've been in our store for other events and also attended many of the live events we've done this year during COVID, Aaron has done several presentations, so you will recognize him. He's going to be kind of hanging out in the background because we have a different person doing the presentation tonight, and his name is Brett Wells. He also works with Sigma, and he has a background in photography that spans over 25 years. So if you have questions during this segment, and I'll remind you about this along the way, be sure to post those in the comments on Facebook or in the chat room on YouTube. And we'll do a little bit of Q&A throughout, and then we'll wrap up the session with more Q&A. Don't be shy, keep those questions coming, okay? So with all that said, I'd love to introduce Brett and have Brett tell us a little bit about him and his background, and then we will dive into his presentation. So Brett, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. So my name is Brett Wells. I am the Southeastern Tech Rep, Aaron's counterpart on the other end of the country. I have been with Sigma for, about 11 years now. I've been in photography for over 25 years. I have a master's degree from the University of Westminster in London. Taught photography at the Art Institute of Atlanta for about 7 or 8 years before getting into the sales and marketing side of things. So I was an independent rep for years and then became a full-time employee of Sigma. So I teach some workshops. I've been doing macro seriously for about 10 years now, teaching workshops in the Smokies and other places, and doing all sorts of classes for wonderful dealers like Glazer. So I'm glad to be here tonight. Really excited about this. And like Kate said, if you have any questions, please just go ahead and post those, and she will let me know what's going on, what kind of questions you have, so we can try to deal with those as they come throughout the presentation. And then obviously you can save some questions for the end, and I'll make sure that there's plenty of time to get to those as well. Okay.
Cool. So I'll just mention real quick before we get started that we have folks tuning in from both coasts, from obviously here in Washington to Michigan to LA to Arizona to South Carolina, Texas. So it's so cool to see so many people registered from all over the country. So for those of you out of state, we can ship to you too. So just so you know. Free shipping on most things over 49 bucks. Anyhow, one last little pitch about that. Brett, let's get rolling with your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, that's always great to have a store that can take care of you and get you what you need and get it sent straight to you. So definitely get to know these people and develop a good relationship with them. All right. So not to scare everybody, this isn't just about flowers, but that seems to be kind of a predominant focus for macro, especially at home when a lot of people are spending more time at home, whether we want to or not. There are lots of flowers around. That is bloodroot. I'll try to identify some of these things as I go through here. This was one of our older lenses that's now discontinued, but kind of a cult following in the bug macro world. That's the 180. That was with our 150. Also with the 150. But as I go through these, and try to notice the aperture. Shutter speed is not going to be as important. We're going to talk about settings, of course, as we get toward the end of the presentation. I'll give you my starting points and some suggestions for where to go, depending on depending on the situation, what you're looking for. But I always like to start with a little bit of technical stuff, get it out of the way first. But that way I know that we're all talking about the same thing and you understand exactly what I mean when I say macro. Traditionally speaking, macro means 1-to-1. It means life-size reproduction. And that is on the sensor in the camera or film if you're still shooting that, or not still, but still shooting, whatever, if you're shooting film. That's reproduction in the camera, because obviously when I put it on a screen or if I make a print, I can reproduce something in a lot larger reproduction ratio after the fact. So we're concerned with what a camera, what a lens is capable of reproducing and recording. So macro is usually 1-to-1. Technically it goes past that, but we'll talk about it a little bit. It's generally hard to get more than macro until you more than 1-to-1 macro until you get into some more specialized equipment. But an ordinary lens might do something like 1-to-5, which is 1/5 or 20% of life size. That's a pretty common. Your 50 millimeter 1.4s or your 85 1.4s or your 70-200s, those kind of lenses usually reproduce something around 1-to-4 or 1-to-5. So they're not going to be anywhere close to macro, but manufacturers have decided to put that terminology of macro on a lens when it gets closer than an ordinary lens, even though it's not true macro. So you'll see that a lot of times a lens that can only reproduce at 1/2 or 1/3 of life size will still say macro on it. And it does frustrate a lot of people because they're trying to get to 1-to-1, but their lens isn't capable of doing that, at least without any additional equipment. Not to say that everything we do has to be 1-to-1. It's not that you're going to shoot every flower and every bug and every whatever it is that you're shooting with macro at that type of reproduction. But it's nice to know that your lens is capable of that when you do want to get that close, or at least to know what your lens is capable of and what it's not. Okay. In order to get to that point, you're focusing closer and closer to the camera. When you focus at infinity, the farthest thing away, the mountains in the distance, your lens is at its shortest point. The focusing elements in the middle of the lens are the closest to the sensor that they'll ever be with something in focus. And as you focus closer to the camera, those elements push farther and farther away, which is why most lenses can't do macro, because they can't move those focusing elements far enough away from the sensor in order to focus really, really close and get true macro, true 1-to-1 reproduction. But macro lenses can. At true macro at 1-to-1, the focusing elements have to actually be twice as far as they were from the sensor for any lens, and it's hard for lenses to be able to do that, and that's one of the reasons. But the reason I share all that technical stuff will actually come into play when we come back to talking about accessories, because there are some things that will give us more magnification out of ordinary lenses, or even more out of a macro lens, if we have a few extra little things, little gadgets. And again, we'll talk about those as we go along here. So that was with our old 50. Obviously inside on a tripod, it was shot at 15 seconds. Not something you're going to try to do handheld. This is also something completely indoors, completely artificial. The flower's real, and we're going to talk about some of these techniques as we go through here as well. But it's something that's very easy to do when you're inside because you don't have wind moving the flowers. You can keep taking pictures and try light sources from different directions. You can try different backgrounds, and you have the time to compose the image exactly like you want. And you can stop, you can go run errand, whatever, and come back and have everything still sitting on your dining room table waiting for you if you don't need it for something else anyway. So that's something to consider. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the equipment and technique for doing this type of thing indoors as we go through here as well. So that is outdoors. That was a butterfly garden down in South Florida. But just to show you that even with a lens that's not a true macro at the 100 to 400 contemporary lens, and there's a version for SLRs and now a version for Sony and L-mount mirrorless cameras, are perfectly capable of about a third life-size reproduction, which is perfect for this type of subject. Okay, what do we use macro lenses for then? I always like to think that I can do more than one thing with a piece of equipment that I spend money on. The common answer that I get for this is flowers. Probably 3/4 of the people in presentations, that's what they're looking to shoot, to photograph with a macro lens. The next most common answer is definitely bugs, and it could be all sorts of things: spiders and centipedes and millipedes, wasps, you name it. There's all sorts of things like that you can photograph. And again, in and around your house, maybe outside and around your house, hopefully you'll find lots of bugs to photograph, and obviously they're going to be different in different parts of the country as well. Food, I already showed you some examples of that. There's probably some more as we go through here. Another common use for macro lenses, collections, stamps, currency, jewelry, collectibles, to photograph the little tiny hallmarks or serial numbers or things like that on a piece of collectible, whatever it might happen to be. One that a lot of people don't think about is portraiture. So most macro lenses tend to fall in the portrait range, so slightly long. We make a 70, we make a 105. They're both really, really nice portrait length lenses, either on a full frame camera or on an APS-C camera. They're extremely sharp. They're 2.8 aperture lenses, so it's easy to throw the background out of focus. Just another thing that you can do with a macro lens. And then the last thing here is art reproduction. Macro lenses are what we call flat field lenses. Without getting too technical, they're designed to focus on something that's perfectly flat. So they are they have very little distortion, so they're very good for reproducing artwork and that type of thing. Okay. So that's the pay attention to your surroundings lesson. I was at a trade show and windows behind me was kind of slow. Everybody was in a class and I turned around and stuck on the window staring at me is this bug. And thankfully he was very kind to and patient to wait for me to grab a lens and put it on a camera and take his picture. But okay. The lenses from Sigma, the stuff that we make currently, we have a 70 millimeter macro, and I have these on the desk. We can show you at the end. A 70 millimeter 2.8. That lens is made for Canon SLRs and Sony mirrorless cameras. There's a former model of the 105 or the original model of the 105, an EX model that is full frame lens, stabilized. It is designed for Canon and Nikon mirrorless cameras, or sorry, Canon and Nikon SLRs, DSLRs, and with an adapter will go on Sony mirrorless, Canon mirrorless, Nikon mirrorless. There's a brand new 105 2.8, the DG-DN macro lens, which is designed specifically for Sony mirrorless and L-mount mirrorless cameras as well. I have a few images through that. I was fortunate enough to be asked to shoot the first look blog with that lens and was really blown away. And then the lenses in quotes, the macro lenses, the 18 to 200, the 18 to 300, and the 17 to 70. They're all right around 1 to 3. I think one of them does 1 to 2.9. They're not full, true one-to-one reproduction. They're not full frame lenses either. So they're for either APS-C or smaller sensor SLR cameras, or again, we'll work on Canon or Nikon with their adapters, or Sony with our adapter. So that's with the original EX macro, the 105. Something else to think about here, we'll talk about depth of field and how it relates to macro, but you can see this shot that even at f/22, there's very little depth of field because I was so extremely close to the subject. And again, we'll come back to that, but just consider that this is f/22 and there's still not that much depth of field. And that's natural. That was actually outside, and that is morning dew. Although there's a real easy way to make it anything look like that, and we'll talk about that too. I won't give away all the secrets, but or not yet. But I definitely will as we go through here. That one is outside in a garden. That's a trout lily. Okay, so there are macro lenses all the way from 40 and 50 millimeters, all the way up to 80 and 200 millimeters. And even for full frame cameras, you have that entire range of lenses. So with all of those options, why wouldn't we just pick the smallest, lightest, least expensive macro lens? Well, to me, the number one thing, the first consideration that I have in picking a lens is what I call working distance. And it's not a term I came up with, but different from a manufacturer's spec, which is called close focus distance or minimum focus distance, which sometimes you'll see referred to as CFD or MFD in the specs about a piece of equipment. And that measurement is from the sensor in the camera to the subject. The problem with that is it doesn't take into account the thickness of the camera body and the length of the lens. For a normal lens, a long lens like a 370 to 200 or a 300 or 150 to 600, the difference between 6 and 6.5 feet or something on the minimum focus distance is probably not ever going to come into play. But on a macro lens, when it tells you you have a 10-inch minimum focus distance, but you're really only 2 inches from the front of the lens, that gets to be a problem. The farther back you can be from the subject, the less likely you are to block the light, the less likely you are to cast a shadow on subjects or something like that. The less likely you are to encroach a subject like a bug that doesn't want you to be that close, or you don't want to get that close to it, like a bee or a wasp or something like that. So even if you're shooting dragonflies, you're not going to shoot a dragonfly with a 40 or 50, 60 millimeter lens because you'll never be able to get close enough to that to photograph him and even come close to filling the frame. So a longer lens is better for those types of things. The other side is true though. If you're shooting larger subjects, if you want to shoot a large rose, you don't want 180 millimeter macro lens because you're going to be 6 feet away from it to get it to fit in the frame. So that's something to consider. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second too. Then the next is angle of view. So as the focal length of a lens gets longer, any camera system, as I go to a longer focal length lens, I have a narrower field of view or angle of view. And that just helps me isolate the subject from the background. That's not always what you're looking for. Sometimes it's nice to have more background behind a subject, even for macro, but for a lot of macro, it's really nice to be able to isolate the subject from the background, to minimize the clutter that's in the background, things like that. So a narrower angle of view is generally preferable. The stabilization on a lens, a lot of times my camera's on a tripod. If I'm shooting indoors and doing a setup, it's nice to have the camera already locked in place so I can get the composition exactly where I want it to be, and I can keep it that way. I don't have to keep holding the camera and trying to get it back in the same place. The same is true outside, and especially with a longer macro lens, it's nice to be able to get the weight out of my hands, put it on a tripod, lock it in place, and I know at least I don't have to worry about the shake of the camera. Still have to worry about the subject moving outside, but that's another story. But if I'm shooting bugs, if I'm shooting anything that's moving, it's very difficult to shoot on a tripod. Some people shoot bugs with a monopod, which is just, a single leg. And for those, then it'll help some. But having some stabilization in the lens, if you're hand holding it, can really make a difference. Or having stabilization built into the camera body for some of the newer mirrorless cameras is definitely useful as well. Okay. Then obviously the size of the lens, the weight of the lens, the price of the lens. My personal preference for most people, when somebody says what macro lens should I get, for most people on a full frame camera, I would really recommend a 105. On a crop sensor, it's a 70. I love our old, the 180 macro, but it's so big and so heavy and took up the space of two other lenses in the camera bag. So I found that I didn't carry it around with me much, even though it was a really great lens and extremely sharp. It's nice to have something that's a little bit shorter, a little bit smaller and lighter, and takes up less room in the camera bag. So and then obviously, what else can I do with this lens? Am I going to use it for portraits? Am I going to use it for just walking around, documentary kind of things, street photography, whatever else it might be? Then that's something to consider when you're picking out a macro lens as well. Okay. That was a butterfly garden out in Phoenix, Arizona, actually. That's in the Smoky Mountains. It's a flower called Dutchman's Breeches. You'll see there are 3 flowers in the park that have, well, in general areas, not just the Smoky Mountains, but at least over here on the East Coast. I don't know what y'all have on the West Coast. There are 3 different plants that have exactly the same leaves, almost identical. And the only way to tell them apart is when they bloom. One of them is Dutchman's Breeches. The next is Bleeding Heart. And the third is Squirrel Corn, I believe is what it's called. So you should see at least one more of those as we go through here. All right, I told you how to get back to working distance. And to show you the difference between working distance, which is the distance from the front element of the lens, and close focus distance, which is measured from the sensor in the camera. What I did is set up a bunch of different macro lenses on a tripod, same subject, put it in manual focus, turn the lens all the way around till it was at its closest focus point, farthest extension, and then took the whole camera and slid it forward on a rail until the subject was in focus, and then pulled out a tape measure and measured from the front element of the lens to the subject. And so our 50 and 70 millimeter macro, and the new 70 is right in line with this, is between 2 and 3 inches. It's going to be that for almost anybody's 50, 60, 70 millimeter macro lens. There are laws of physics that govern a lot of the parameters of the lenses, and focus distance is going to be one of them. So to get really close focus with a shorter macro lens, you're going to be about 2 to 3 inches away. The 90 to 105 millimeter lenses, you'll be up closer to 5 or 6 inches. The 105 EX is 5.15. I don't know the new 105D GDN. I haven't had it long enough, or I didn't have it long enough in my hands to actually test that part out. Then when you get into longer macro lenses, the 150 is going to give you 7.5 inches. The 180 gave you 8.75. And keep in mind, this is at 1:1. This is a true macro reproduction. So if you're not focusing something that close, 2:1, you're twice this far away. So 2:1 with a 50 to 70 millimeter lens, you're now at about 4 to 5, maybe 6 inches away, which is kind of nice. With a 180, now you're almost 1.5 feet away, and that can actually be a problem. Sometimes the longer lenses, you have to back up too far to shoot. So that's why I say the 105s for full frame cameras seem to be the sweet spot. And you can get in close, you can get in tight without getting right on top of a subject, but you can still shoot larger things as well. It's just kind of a nice compromise for an all-around macro lens, general purpose kind of macro lens. Okay. That was down at the Butterfly Garden in Florida as well. That's also out in the park. It's purple hepatica. I remember that one. So you can see that at f22 as well, that the second flower is very soft. The background's completely out of focus. This is actually Aaron's image that we stole from him. So also with the 100 to 400, which gives you a little bit more distance than shooting something shorter, like a 105 macro. When you extend a lens like this farther out, you can be farther away and not scare away a bug like this. Okay. So what else do we need other than the camera and the lens? The first thing that I really recommend everybody get is a good solid tripod. Like I said, if you're shooting bugs, a monopod might be a really nice way to go. But for most types of things, if the subject's not moving, a tripod's the way to go. And you want something that's pretty solid with this. It's not as critical as shooting 30-second exposures at night or shooting waterfalls where your tripod might be sitting in the river. So you don't have to have the absolute best, but something good and solid is nice. I'm a big fan of Arca Swiss, which Arca Swiss is a camera company, been around for a long time, but their biggest contribution to photography is a standardized lens plate. It's kind of an hourglass profile from the side, have little notches or angled notches on the side of it. The advantages to it, one is it's the closest thing to a universal standard, and even manufacturers and tripods that never had Arca Swiss camera or Arca Swiss heads are now going to that more and more. So it's becoming an even bigger standard, which is really nice to see. There are lenses that have feet already that are designed for Arca Swiss tripod heads, so you don't have to have another plate. You can buy L brackets for your cameras. Anyway, without getting way outside of the macro range, it's a nice thing to have, but for macro, it's going to come into play as well. The next thing then is a cable release. The last thing you want to do when your camera's on a tripod and you're focused at something really close with a lot of magnification is push the button with your finger, because you're going to shake the camera. And macro magnifies everything. It magnifies the subject, but it also magnifies all of the movement in the camera, in the subject, whatever. So everything that we do, we're trying to eliminate motion in both of those things. And we'll talk about a lot of ways to do that. The number one is get a cable release. Timers can work in your living room. It's great. Shouldn't make any difference in the world. You have a flower set up and you push a button on the camera, give it 5 seconds on the timer. It'll count down. The camera stabilizes and the camera's not shaking when the shutter fires. Outside, when you're shooting a flower in the wind in your garden, wherever, it doesn't really work very well. What I find is even using live view, I can watch the flower stop moving and the wind dies down, and I push the button, and before the timer counts down and the shutter trips, the gust of wind comes in and shakes the flower again. So cable release is a nice thing to have. And wired, wireless, it doesn't make any difference to me, whatever it is that's your preference for triggering the camera. Okay, told you I'd come back. Long lens plate. So the nice thing about Arca Swiss is it's not just a little square or a rectangular plate. You can get plates that are longer because the head only grips the plates from the side. The advantage is if you have a lens that has a foot, you can use a long lens plate as a nodal rail or a macro rail for sliding your whole camera and lens closer and farther from the subject. It helps you with composition, helps you get to fine-tune magnification, all sorts of things like that. And it doubles as a lens plate for a long lens. It doubles as a camera plate. It's just a good all-around kind of thing to leave in your camera bag. Next thing that you should probably consider is bringing some sort of light to the party. You'll find that when you're shooting with macro, shutter speeds become really important. And one way that we can get to faster shutter speeds, one way we can get to faster shutter speeds is bringing some sort of continuous light to the situation, whether that's an LED panel or little LED lights. And there's dozens of different companies that make those. A flashlight, as long as it's daylight balanced. Inside, any kind of lights that you have, even if it's your lamps and they're old tungsten bulbs, you can set your camera in tungsten white balance. So any sort of thing that will bring light to the situation will help you get faster shutter speeds. Then you can consider flash, and You can try the pop-up flash on your lens, but as you get something close to the front of the lens, or sorry, the pop-up flash on your camera, but the lens will actually block some of the light coming from that pop-up flash. So it's probably not the best way to go. That the built-in dedicated, or not built-in, sorry, the speed lights that are made for any type of camera systems tend to overpower macro. So you usually end up getting smaller lights, putting them on cables so you can move them around. There are ring flashes that will go on the front of lenses. There are all sorts of different accessories. We could spend hours just talking about lighting systems for macro. For what most people are going to do, I really recommend just a little LED. A small LED light or an LED panel or something like that. It's a really nice thing. Fits in the camera bag well. You can use it inside, you can use it outside. Just a real useful sort of thing to have for macro. A reflector. I like the 5-in-1s. You're talking like a normal photo reflector that you might use for portrait work, but preferably smaller. Again, inside, it's not going to make any difference. Outside, the wind will pick up a big reflector and off it goes. So it's nice to have something smaller, maybe 12, 15, 18 inches. The 5-in-1s are great because usually the middle piece is a diffuser, so you can hold it over your flower and soften the light. Then you have a white surface, a black surface that you can use to bounce light, absorb light. You might have a silver or a gold that you can bounce a little bit more light. You can use the white or the black as a black or as a background. Excuse me. I'll try to get that out. You can use the whole thing to block the wind, put it right beside your flower, upwind, or your subject, whatever it happens to be. So again, another useful thing to have. There are close-up filters. They're also known as diopters. Some people call them magnifying filters. There are bad ones and good ones, definitely. There are some that are dedicated. Our 18-300, we make a specific filter, a filter specifically designed for that lens that takes it to 1:2 magnification instead of 1:3. And it's actually really good because it's designed specifically for that lens. You'll find some combinations work well, some don't. In general, I'm not a fan. I'd rather have a lens that was designed to get to macro because I think you'll find that you end up with sharper images. But if you have one or you want to play around with one, it can make an average lens give it more macro capability. So it's a way to play around with this type of stuff. So I always look for little details. So as I was photographing this, which is a wild orchid, there was the ant on the back, and I just kind of waited and waited and waited until he got to the right position where I wanted him in the frame. And generally they cooperate, but sometimes not. But I'm always looking for little things like that, in flowers, on flowers, bees flying around, all sorts of stuff like that. Those are pink lady slippers, also in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. One of the rarest flowers in the park, and something that people come just to try to find. Some people come for years and never actually get to see them, but that's the only time I think I've ever been outside and could shoot at a 15th of a second too. It really was a true calm morning, which most of the time, even when you think there isn't any wind, you look through the viewfinder on the camera or the LCD screen on the back and you see your flowers shaking back and forth. So there's almost always wind even when you think there's not. The magnolia, those are pretty common, easy to find. Some other accessories. So if you remember back from the first slide, I told you that macro lenses get to macro. They do what they do by extending farther and farther away from the camera, more so than a normal lens. Well, if there was a way to space an average lens farther away from the camera than it would normally be, it would be able to focus closer. And if it could focus closer, it could magnify the image more. And that thing is called an extension tube, or those things. They generally come in sets of three different thicknesses, and you can use them in any combination, any one, any two, or all three at the same time. They are literally made for every camera mount I have ever looked for. Even cameras that haven't been made for 30 years, somebody still makes a set of extension tubes for them. So it's something, again, that you can get. You can add them to macro lenses and get even more magnification. You can add them to non-macro lenses and get closer to macro. So they're a very interesting thing to play around with. The problem with shorter lenses, the shorter it is, the more macro, closer to macro you're going to get, but the closer to the front element you're going to get, you're going to end up focusing as well. If you put it on a real short lens, like a wide angle lens, you won't actually be able to focus with all of the rings on it anymore. The focus actually goes inside the front element, and it's kind of no longer useful at that point. The other thing to note about extension tubes, there are two basic types. There are mechanical, like whatever. There are ones with electronics, there are ones without electronics. Even 10 years ago, it was important to have the ones with electronics because it's hard to work an aperture or whatever, even on DSLRs, without those. With modern cameras, most lenses won't even function now. Like on a Sony mirrorless camera, a lot of lenses just won't even do anything. They won't focus. They won't. You can't move the apertures. You can't do anything if there's not electronics. So you want to make sure that they have contacts in those extension tubes. Okay. I mentioned macro rail, and using a long lens rail as a macro rail, you can kind of move up. The next step up from that is a long rail that actually has a clamp on one end. So you can use that to clamp the body of the camera on a shorter macro lens and slide it forward and backward in an Arca Swiss head. And again, just to fine tune composition. There are rail systems that are geared that you can actually move forward and backward, side to side. And then some tripods have gears that you can raise and lower. So the people that do really, really, really tiny stuff with really critical precision focusing are using rail systems for that type of stuff, like to shoot the eye of a bug or something like that. They're also using focus stacking for that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Another trick for flowers especially, if you want to save yourself some time in Photoshop, get a soft brush, a big makeup brush, a fine art, like a paintbrush, but something big and soft. And you can use it to clean out flowers. You can get the little debris and dead bugs and those kind of things out of the flower. I told you before, I'd teach you how to fake morning dew. Get a spray bottle. Any little spritzer bottle is fine. Go to the drugstore. You can find glycerin. And you generally mix glycerin about 50-50 with water. Put it in your spray bottle, shake it up, and spray that on your flower. You can use regular water. The problem with regular water is if it's warm especially, it'll just beat up and roll off. The glycerin has a lot more viscosity, and it'll actually cling to the flower and stay where it is. It's an old product photographer's trick. If you've ever seen the bottles of Coke with all the little beads of water droplets on it, those aren't water droplets. They're all pure glycerin, and somebody put them all on there with a toothpick. To make it all look perfect. So you can actually do that as well. You can take a toothpick and literally put drops of glycerin on your flower or on your subject or whatever. Then the next is something to hold your subject still, maybe some other things. There's a product called a plamp. It's made by a company called Wimberley that's famous for making gimbal heads for long lenses. Plamp is short for plant clamp, and that's the picture of it over on the left. It's got a big clamp, like a hardware clamp that goes on your tripod, table leg, tree, whatever. And on the other end, it has a little delicate clamp for holding the stem of a flower to keep it from moving in the wind. The newer clamp is a little bit more stiff and rigid, and you can actually use it to hold your reflectors in place if you're out shooting by yourself, things like that. Any kind of clamp systems, from super clamps from the big tripod companies, to clamps from a hardware store, anything like that. Sometimes you'll find useful. I use old tripods that I would never put a camera on anymore, but I can use that to clamp a reflector onto the tripod leg or up on top of it or whatever. Anything like that you can find holding lights in place or holding up a background, something like that. All right, and then the next thing I said I'd come back to is the fake backgrounds, the indoor macro studio, if you will. So that flower that you saw, and there'll be another one or two as we go through here, and I'll point them out, that are shot indoors. I have little LED panels on tripods. My camera's on a tripod. The flowers, go to the garden store, go to the grocery store, whatever, and just bring home a nice looking flower, put it on your dining room table, and then I can spend all the time in the world that I want to position lights, get it exactly how I want. One bit of advice that I always have for light, and this any kind of artificial light, our goal is to mimic daylight. 99% of the time, the goal of artificial light is to mimic daylight. So daylight is most flattering when it's off at an angle, not when it's directly over our heads. So you want the light to be off on one side of the flower or the other. You don't want it casting really hard shadows, so you can either back the light up some, or you can put a diffuser, a pillowcase, a sheet, whatever in between, and that can help you soften light, balance light, and then you can bounce light in from the other side with a reflector, with poster board, something like that. You can put things up against a wall that will bounce light back in as well. And then the backgrounds. So on a really pretty day, go outside and photograph the clouds, photograph some trees, some grass, those types of things, but take them a little bit out of focus, bring them into Lightroom, Photoshop, soften them up a little bit more, and then print them out 11 by 14, 16 by 20, mount them to a piece of poster board, and you can hold that up behind your subject. You can tape it to the wall in your dining room, whatever, behind the table, wherever it is that you need it to be for your subject. And even on the most miserable rainy days, snow, whatever it is outside, you can make something inside that looks like it was the most beautiful sunny afternoon, even when it's not. So there you go. That's how you fake your whole macro setup inside. Okay. This was macro flash, the one on the left without, the one on the right with. Two things here. One, so our ring light, you could turn one side brighter than the other one. So this is more light coming from the flower from the left side. More light coming in off at an angle helps to accent textures, so you can see more of the texture in the petals of the flower. It also illuminates the inside part of the flower because it's coming in from that side of the scene. The second, though, is with flash falls off very, very quickly. Light does in general. So the closer a light source is to a subject, the more it's going to illuminate the subject and not the background. Flash in particular, because it's so bright and generally for macro pretty close to the subject, it increases the exposure, increases the amount of light. I have to account for that, or the camera is going to do it for me, account for that and turn the exposure back down. The exposure on the subject then stays the same, and the effect of that is the background gets darker because there's more light from the flash hitting the subject than the background. Okay. It is what it is. Some people like it, some people don't. You can always add more light to the background with another flash or another light. You can use a reflector and bounce some of the flash into the background and try to compensate for that. Or you can take this to an extreme and turn the exposure on the flash really high, brighten the subject a lot, compensate the exposure for that, and then the background starts to go almost black, or at an extreme, you can even make the background go completely black. Some people like that look with flowers. Some people think it's very artificial. Totally up to you. Just a technique that some people do, and that's how they do it. So if you want to try it out, you need a flash. That's the easiest way to make the background go completely black. I told you food photography. This is with a full set of extension tubes. So this is our 70 macro with all three of the extension tubes in a set. As best I can figure, it's right around 2.5 times life size without actually measuring it in Lightroom or Photoshop. You can see that even at f16, there's only, how much of an Oreo is that? 1/8 of an inch of depth of field or something? Even then, I was only an inch from the subject, and I was still shooting in a 15th of a second. So you're going to lose more light than a macro lens normally loses. We'll talk about exposure here in a minute. But extension tubes are going to make that even worse. The more you magnify a subject, the more light you lose, and the longer your exposures are going to be. Real quick, because this is another topic that we could spend an entire day. There are times that you cannot get an entire subject in focus in a single frame. So the one on the left is f22, and you can see the very front of the jaw of the orchid is not quite sharp. The back, what's called the throat inside the flower, the back of the petals is starting to get soft as well. But even in a single frame, as high as I could turn my lens, I couldn't capture everything in one exposure. There are a few answers. One of them is you can back up. The farther away from the subject you are, the more depth of field you'll get for the same aperture, the same f-stop number. And you know that to be true, because if I focus on a portrait and shoot somebody 8 feet away, I may have a couple feet of depth of field. But if I just refocus the camera and leave all my settings the same and focus on the mountain in the distance, I have miles of depth of field. So you've encountered this, whether you've thought it through exactly how it works, but macro brings it to the extreme. When you focus really, really close, you have very, very little depth of field. So backing up will give you more, and then you just have to know you're going to crop when you get back into the computer. With today's high-res cameras, that's probably not a real issue. The second, though, is you can do what's called focus stacking, and that is taking a sequence of images starting from the closest thing you want in focus and refocusing through the image. Some cameras now will do this for you. A lot of the mirrorless cameras, a couple of the Nikon cameras. Sorry. I know Canon mirrorless cameras do it. I'm not sure if any of their SLRs do or not. If the camera that you have doesn't, there are devices that you can add externally and plug in that will do that as well, that basically automate the process. One of them is called Cam Ranger. That's what I've used in the past. And that's actually what was used for this. So instead of shooting at f/22, you can shoot at f/5.6, which there's a lot of reasons why that would be a better thing. It's going to be sharper. You have less chance of something moving. And then this was a series of about 20 images at 5.6. And then software will put it back together. Lightroom and Photoshop will both do it. I use a product called Zerene, Z-E-R-E-N-E. Just my preference for, I think it does a better job. It doesn't leave as much ghosting and halo and stuff like that around the subject as Lightroom and Photoshop. But Zerene isn't free. You can download it and try it for 30 days, where you probably already have Lightroom and Photoshop. So if you're going to experiment with this, do it the free way first, and then decide later if you're going to upgrade to something else. That was also done with focus stacking. That's with the new 105D GDN. So a series of about 12 images at f11. There is no way. That's the full frame, a little bit trimmed off the edges, but that's the full height of the frame. There is no way in the world that you could get something with an inch of depth of field all in focus when it's filling the frame that close without something like focus stacking. Okay, so once you've got everything else figured out, you've got all your equipment, starting points here. There's always exceptions to all of this. Any rule of photography, there's always an exception to it, but this is just kind of where I'm thinking. If I pull my camera out of the car and I'm walking down a trail in the woods, if I go out into my backyard to photograph something, I generally just set the camera at f11. That's my first thought, and that's going to be the first thing I set is aperture. For macro, my depth of field is probably going to be the most critical thing, so that's what I'm going to set first. And like I said, I'm usually at f11. Rarely am I below f8. Even with a larger subject, even a little farther away, you'll find that you're not going to get everything in focus that you want in focus at a number lower than f8 usually. If you really want to isolate something from the background, or you want razor thin depth of field in a subject, then by all means, go to 2.8, go to 4, go to 5.6. But and then sometimes I'm going up to f16, rarely to f22. If a lens goes higher than that, and we'll talk about numbers here in a little bit, but usually I'm at probably f11 to f16. That's kind of normal. Shutter speeds. So even though these are shorter lenses and I'm probably hand holding or probably on a tripod, I still want to keep my shutter speeds high at around 125 if I can, for the fact that outside there's always going to be something moving, always some little gust of wind. And again, macro magnifies the motion of the subject. So having a little higher shutter speed is going to help me compensate for that. If it's a really still calm morning, evening, then by all means you can go down 30, 60. If you're indoors, then time is really irrelevant if the subject's not moving. something's on your dining room table, then it really doesn't make any difference. You can shoot it for 2 seconds or 4 seconds, and you can still end up with a really sharp picture as long as your tripod is locked down and subject's not moving and all those kind of things. ISO, again, outdoors, I'm almost always starting at about 1600. That's true for a lot of things I shoot outdoors, actually, except for landscapes. But if it's wildlife, flowers, any of those types of things, I'm going to start around 1600 ISO. If I can get away with it, I will go down to 800 or 400, as long as I can keep my aperture high enough to keep the depth of field I want and my shutter speed high enough to freeze the motion in the subject. Then I'll turn my ISO lower. If there's a lot of wind, if there's low light, I may end up going up to 32, sometimes higher than that. But you'll find most of the time you can get the picture that you want, even outdoors around your house or in the wild or wherever, at about 32 or up to about 3200. Indoors, I'm starting with native. Whatever the lowest number is on your camera, without it saying L1 or L2 or L.3 or whatever, those artificially low settings. Most cameras are 100, some are 200, some go down to 64, but you'll find that it's in that range. There are a lot of reasons to shoot native ISO. The easy explanation is it will give you the best image quality. Lowest noise, best dynamic range, best color sensitivity, all of those things. So it is the ideal situation is we'd always shoot at native ISO, but reality is we can't always do that. But indoors, again, macro on a tripod, there's no reason that I can't. So I'm going to do that just to get better results. White balance for outdoors or for artificial lights that are daylight balanced, just set your white balance to daylight. You're going to be 99% there, that close enough that you can make little tweaks in the computer after the fact without losing any kind of information. Even for outdoors, daylight white balance is going to take in or not take into account early morning and evening, the warming of the light, which is nice because that way we get to take advantage of that. If you leave your camera in auto, it will try to compensate those things for that warm light in the morning and the evening, and you'll end up with neutral, and it kind of negates the reason for going out and shooting in that beautiful warm light. In teaching workshops, this just happened 2 weeks ago. We were shooting sunrise and was trying to remind everybody, shoot on daylight, don't shoot on auto. And somebody said, why? And I said, because all those beautiful warm colors are going to go away. And so anyway, outside, my camera's usually on daylight anyway, not on auto. I'm always manually focusing with macro. Focus is just too critical. It's too fine-tuned. The depth of field is so shallow. I'm always going to be doing this manually. I'm not ever going to trust the camera lens to do it or the camera to autofocus my lens for me. What I do use, though, is focus peaking on mirrorless cameras or live view that have that, or focus magnification. I'm a Nikon shooter mostly, and on the button that moves the focus point around, I have it set to push the middle of that, and it'll automatically zoom live view into 100%. So I can fine tune the focus exactly where I want it to be. I can still move the focus point around within the image, zoom into 100% there, and focus really, really precisely without having to try to do that through the viewfinder or in a full frame situation, whatever. So any help that your camera will give you for focusing accurately, critically, is something you definitely want to take advantage of. The next thing is I'm always using the histogram. And I'm using highlight warnings. I don't know if I have that put in here or not, but those two things are on almost any camera. They come in different forms and different people, they call them different things or whatever. Histogram is always a histogram. We'll come back to that in just a second, but highlight warnings, usually it's set that in preview mode, it will flash in the areas that are overexposed. And you just want to make sure that nothing is overexposed, especially in a white flower or something like that. Some cameras will do it, mirrorless cameras a lot. Sometimes cameras with live view will do it where it'll show you that before you take the picture. Some of that, the video terminology for that is zebra. So you'll see that in some cameras as well. So I'm using that to make sure I'm not blowing out. I'm also using the histogram, which is a map of values. It's a graph, black on the left, white on the right. and it's just a map of all of the values in your image. And you can have it for a previewed image that you've already taken, or you can have it for an image that for a live view for something that you're shooting, and you can have a live histogram that shows up in the corner of the screen or whatever. There's always a way to turn that on. It's going to be different for every camera, but I'm sure that you can find that in your manual, or Google that or something like that. But here's the difference in macro versus almost any other type of photography. The histogram's an average. Most histograms, if it's white, it's an average. I mean, if the graph is white, it's an average of all the red, green, and blue values in the scene averaged out together. In a normal scene, in a landscape, that's perfectly fine. For a flower, a red flower, it's going to get it wrong. I promise. Every time it's going to get it wrong. It's going to tell you that it's not clipped. Look at the RGB histograms. There's again, 99% of the cameras out there will have a way to turn on not just an overall histogram, but separate histograms for the red, green, and blue channels. And what you'll find is for a red flower, the green and the blue channels look great, and the red channel is going to clip. If you lose detail in any channel, especially the main channel for the flower, you lose detail. There's no way to bring it back in post. So don't just trust the overall average histogram. Take a look at your RGBs and make sure that they're not clipping when you're shooting a red subject, a blue subject, something other than an average white. Sorry. I told you I'd show you another example of indoors. So that is on a table, reflector on the right, LED panel above, left about 45 degrees above. And a little bit in front. Look at shadows in a subject. You can actually, they'll kind of tell you where the light is coming from. So you can see the shadow of some of those petals on the ones underneath. And you can see, or the parts of the flower in the back on the stem, and you can see where the light's coming from. The background is just a print, an inkjet print on a piece of poster board. Have the luxury of shooting something like that at a full second in a completely controlled situation. And it's not as hard as it sounds. You can use other things than prints for backgrounds. I've used like this background behind me for things. And you can add different colors of light and make the background look different colors. There's all sorts of little tricks you can do. That's with our new 105 macro as well. And that is at 6400 ISO. And I'm still only at a 50th of a second, which was the bare minimum to try to handhold this, even with some stabilization. And at f16, I've still only got about a half of the frog in focus. Really sharp focus, only his head. So you can see that that's what it took in order to shoot this in an enclosed environment, in a dark environment, that I had to be able to shoot at that kind of ISO. And that's one of the things where some cameras are better than others. The newer the camera, the better it's going to be at those kind of ISO settings. But you don't know till you try. That's the thing I'd tell you anybody about ISO. And again, the new 105 macro. This is outside, so even a 20th of a second with some stabilization in the camera, that was about as much as I could get away with. There was some movement, but I was shooting with a cable release in between little gusts of wind. And you can see on the right, that's a crop from the image on the left, just how incredibly sharp this lens is and how incredibly sharp a picture can be if you get things right, stop the motion, get the depth of field right, all of those things. When everything falls into place, you can get some really, really sharp images with detail that you'd never be able to see with a human eye if you were standing there in front of the flower. That's one of the things that I love about photography in general, is seeing things differently than the human eye sees them, whether that's details or motion or any number of things. But anyway, won't make it too much of a sales pitch. Oh, I will leave you with a few tips here, and then we'll take a couple questions. The first is, especially for macro, the lens is really more important than the camera. Even your 5-year-old Canon Rebel is going to do a decent job. Even your A7, whatever, your first generation A7 can still do great macro photography if you have a really good lens in front of it. And again, you don't know till you try. So go out there and shoot with what you have, and then hopefully that leads you to think about what the next step is if you get serious about this kind of thing. Always trying to eliminate motion. The tripod's going to help. The cable release helps. Bringing light to the situation helps. Keeping the shutter speed high helps. But that's always a challenge for macro photography. It's freezing motion in the camera and the subject. So I told you before, macro lenses lose light, they eat light. It's not exactly true, but if you think about light coming into a lens and crossing at a single point, it comes out from the middle of the lens like a cone. So it's a single point, and it's a circle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it comes through the lens. A normal lens is designed to cover the sensor at the range that it can focus. But at macro, because I've extended the lens farther away, that cone gets bigger, the circle of light gets bigger, and you're still cropping a smaller part of the image out from the sensor. I mean, this is theoretical because obviously the camera and the body of the lens is blocking a lot of that cone of light, but it's the same amount of light filling the circle, whether it's a smaller circle or a bigger circle. As it expands, there's just less light per square inch, less exposure. To the extent that at macro, you're losing 2 stops of light. It's physics. Any lens, if it can achieve macro, will lose 2 stops of light. And that just makes our life even more difficult. Some cameras, you'll actually see the number change on, like the f-stop will go from 2.8 to 4 to 5.6. It's not because something happened in the lens. It's just showing you that you're losing light. That's all. Also, we covered depth of field. There's really never enough. You can turn the aperture higher. You can back up. You can use focus stacking. You can use your creative license and creative freedom to shoot with shallow depth of field. Try it all. Back up, get closer. And then the last thing I'm going to leave you with here is a bit of advice that in all of the workshops that I've taught, when we do an image review and image critique, the number one piece of feedback from the attendees, not from me, but from people looking at each other's pictures, is that's great. It would be really cool if you got in closer. Most people have no idea what their macro lens can really do. Switch your macro lens to manual focus, turn it as close as it'll go, the focus ring all the way around to the other end from infinity, and then move yourself, move the camera, move the lens closer to the subject until it's in focus. Then at least you're aware of what that lens is really capable of doing. And again, you don't always have to shoot that close, but a lot of people will just start 18 inches or 2 feet away from a subject, snap a picture and be done with it. And they don't really know that they could have gotten closer and couldn't have created a much stronger composition anyway. So you've got the equipment, you've already got the memory card, fill it up, try it out, see what you can do. One more lesson, that's the 150 to 600, and that's definitely not one-to-one macro, but you can do a lot with what you've already got. And that's indoors with a fake background, actually with the background behind me that I lit to look blue instead of gray. I think that's it. That's it. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed that. Please, questions, if anybody has anything that they would like to ask. I guess I need to undo that.
Yep. Hey, Brett, we do have a few questions that rolled in just this last few minutes here. Right. So are you ready? I'm just going to fire them all off.
Yeah. Okay.
So are you typically using manual or aperture priority when you do this?
So 99% of what I shoot is in manual.
Okay.
The only thing that I don't, no, I'm just going to say 99% of what I shoot is in manual.
Okay, that's fine.
I think what you'll find is the more you learn, the more you realize that the camera is making decisions for you that really may not be exactly what you want them to be. And so because I'm setting aperture for depth of field, shutter speed for motion, I don't really want the camera to try to figure out one or the other.
It can't read your mind.
They're smarter than they've ever been, but
yeah, they still can't read your mind.
Right.
Okay, so we have Nicole, who's new to photography and loving macro. She has a 40mm lens right now. What do you think would be the next best lens for her to upgrade to?
The question that I'd have is what camera are you going to put it on? Because that really does make a difference. Is the
Okay, Nicole, if you're still with us, let us know what camera you're on, and we'll go to some of the other questions that have come in, and maybe we can find that out. What focus point are you using? Do you use single point? I feel like for something like this, single point would probably be the smart decision.
Yes, especially if you're going to let the camera do the focusing for you, you definitely want to be in single point, and that way you can move it to exactly the right part of the flower that you want it to be, or subject. In general, depth of field falls about a third in front of the subject and 2/3 behind. When you're at macro, it's closer to half and half. So you're going to think through your flower and try to picture what is halfway through, what you want to be in focus, and then put the focus point right there if you're going to let the camera do the focusing. Even if I'm in live view, though, I'm still doing exactly that. I'm picturing where the focus point should be, putting it there, and then magnifying the image, and then manually focusing on that point.
And with the newer mirrorless cameras, some of those cameras actually will zoom in for you when you're getting into that detail, especially if you're doing manual focus.
Automatically do that.
Right?
Yeah. And some of them even touch screens, you can just, I want that in focus.
Exactly. Okay, so Nicole got back to us. She has a Nikon 5600, which is one of their little DSLRs. So something that would be Nikon compatible. So she's looking for something to just give her a little more versatility in what she's saying zoom, but I'm assuming she means by that a longer reach than 40 millimeter. So
the lens we make for Nikon is the 105.
Okay.
It's the E model of that. It's great lens, autofocus stabilized, sharp, and it'll be a nice complement to the 40 that you already have. So if you're shooting bigger subjects, the 40 is great. If you're shooting smaller stuff or want to be a little farther away, the 105 would be really good.
Okay. So we are running about 7 minutes over, so I'm just going to do a couple more of these questions and then we're going to wrap this up. So you were talking a little bit about color, I believe, earlier. Could you talk about like how you tackle purples? I know pinks, oranges, and reds are also challenging. While our sensors see a lot, it tends to kind of squish those colors up a little bit in a way. And I do find that I work on those colors in post-production a fair bit. Do you have any tips for dealing with some of those colors that tend to get a little bit more saturated, like purples?
I do, and it goes back to exactly what I was saying before about the RGB histogram. So the problem is in almost any camera, they're Bayer array, which means that out of every 4 pixels, 2 are green, but only 1 is red and 1 is blue. So if you're shooting a subject that is red, your 46 megapixel camera, only 11.5 million pixels are picking up that flower. And that's a problem because you don't have as much detail to capture in that. And it's going to be a saturated color is going to push to the right side of the histogram. So when they clip, it's almost impossible to bring it back and get it to be exactly the right color again. But keeping your color balance set as closely as you can to the actual light source, to the color temperature of the light, or bringing lights in that are balanced for the white balance of the camera. And then making sure that your red, green, and blue histogram channels don't clip. Will give you a lot more information to deal with when you get back into the computer.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I'm going to take a moment to just thank you and Sigma and Aaron hanging out in the background, who also was answering a little bit of questions on YouTube as they were coming in. We appreciate this time and your energy. I know it's late out there on the East Coast. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. We have more presentations like this coming through the end of the year, so keep checking out our website, glazerscamera.com/workshops. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this session, we do have holiday promotions that started this week. Check your email, come into the store. These promotions are both things that we're putting together with vendors like we normally would for our big holiday sale each year. But since we can't do that in-person sale the way we normally would, we're just going to spread those promos out over the next several weeks. So check your email. If you're not on our mailing list, go sign up for that right now so you can get those updates. And we have more programming on Saturday and a bunch of stuff next week and next weekend. So the party doesn't stop. So check out the schedule. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's good to see so many people here tonight. And we hope you have a great evening. Thanks again.
Thank you.